Number 1. Clear your screen of everything that doesn't need to be on it. That means the reward points UI, your chat log, the guide button, but most importantly, your skill effects. If you're interested in a video with a title like this, there's a pretty good chance that you're looking to improve your bossing and you don't maybe know the boss's mechanics well enough to have your skill effects be mostly visible and still be able to dodge the boss adequately. And even when you know the boss fights really well, there are still some classes that just have such overwhelming visual effects, such as something like an Ice Lightning Mage, that it really just becomes impractical to leave your visual effects on at full visibility, especially when you're fighting a boss that is at your current progression level. If you have overwhelming power, sure, you can get away with it. And whether you leave them on or turn them on at max visibility, you should turn boss silhouettes on, as a lot of bosses have very clear animations that you can tell what attack they're doing just by this outline. Number 2. Keybinds. Keybinds are very personal. We all have our own preferences. I don't believe there to be one perfect solution for everything to do with keybinds in this game, but one thing I do think everybody should do is line up your bursts on your keyboard on like 1 through 9 in preferably the order that they would like to be pressed in. This not only makes the process of activating your burst a really brain dead process where it says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It also just makes the process of playing multiple different characters and bosses very easy because everyone has basically the same order, just a different number of keys they have to press. That being said, sometimes it's going to be unavoidable to put something on a little bit more of a comfortable key to press. Like maybe it's a skill that you have to press once, but then you have to press multiple times afterwards, like with Buccaneer Spirit Bombs. You know, just find what works for you. And in the same thought process, just try to unify your keybinds across your characters as much as possible. You know, I have my Angelic Buster link on G for every character. Every character with a bind has it on control. Hero's Will is V. And speaking of Hero's Will, let's go into number 3, which is, well, you might have guessed, Hero's Will. Every character in the entire game has access to at least one copy of this, and when you get to a high enough level, you get 2. Because there's undoubtedly some of you out there who still don't know what this ability is really useful for, basically for 3 seconds after pressing it, you are immune to various kinds of debuffs, some that you may not even consider debuffs or something you could even resist, such as Pierre's hat from Chaos Root Abyss. And that's not a very serious one. However, when you're going through on a boss mule and you just want to mow down Pierre in a second and maybe you aren't strong enough to outright just one-shot him before he even applies a hat, well, you can use Hero's Will to immune the very first application of a hat, skipping that process entirely. Now that's more of a little bit of quality of life one, something that just makes your life a little bit better, but what about saving your actual life? Well, there are various fights in the middle to late game such as Hard Lotus, Darknell, Gloom, fights where one single stun can easily get you killed. Many of you who are doing Hard Lotus have probably been hit by the tiniest little piece of debris, which in of itself is not threatening, but that stun can cause you to get hit by another one, and then maybe you get hit by a large robot and you die. Well, Here's Will could have stopped that whole horrible chain of events from happening. It could have also saved you from losing a bunch of DPS from getting hit by a darkness ball on Gloom, or various other status effects. Obviously, unless you're a Mahil, you don't intend to get hit by some of these things, so maybe you wouldn't have been able to react with Hero's Will in the first place. But many of us, such as the Mahil with our counter, or us with iframes, we already dodge these things instinctively with those things. But when it comes to Hero's Will, many of us don't even consider it as an option in the moment. Or maybe you do consider it, but you think that a tiny little stun isn't worth the 300-second cooldown. Well, as many of us who do fights like Hard Lotus or Gloom know, one tiny little stun can easily lead to your death. And if a button, no matter how long the cooldown may be, can save your life, isn't it worth pressing? I mean, that's exactly what you hope to save it for, something that will save one of your lives. And the more you use it, the better you will be at considering it as an option. Number 4. This one is short and sweet. We all do it. We are all guilty of it sometimes. Stop dying with your iframes off cooldown. I do this all the time, especially during Darknell. You know, when you fight a boss as many times as I have fought Darknell, you should be pretty good at realizing when a situation is going to be dangerous. And if you have an iframe off cooldown, especially me on a Dawn Warrior with like a 40-second one, there's no excuse for saving it. Just use it and get out of there. It's gonna come off cooldown again. You're gonna get another chance to use it. And when you die and your iframe is sitting off cooldown, you know you messed up. Number 5. Sometimes you're gonna die. And when you die, for the most part, unless you're in a group where you have to hold your burst for someone else's cooldowns to sync up, you're going to be in one of 2 scenarios. You're either going to die during your burst, or you're going to die while your burst is currently on cooldown. And if your burst is on cooldown, you should stay dead for as long as you possibly can. Why would you want to do this? Well, to let your burst come off cooldown. Even if you're more of a DPM focused class like Corsair or Bowmaster, it's still a little bit better to just stay dead. Let your bind come back. And obviously, it goes without saying that this is for bosses where you actually have a chance of failing or dying out on. If your main concern or struggle is just running out of time and not having enough DPS, obviously resurrect and do some damage, because even off burst is better than nothing, and at that point there's no reason to stay dead. This is particularly for those kill or be killed fights. Hard Magnus was a perfect example back in the day before his many nerfs. Number 6. Mini bursts. These are the abilities that have lower cooldowns than the rest of your main burst. For most 3-minute burst classes, this is things like the Angelic Buster Link, and anything else that has 90 seconds or less. Utilizing these and properly fitting them in as soon as they're off cooldown is something that can increase your overall DPS on a boss fight by a pretty good amount. But here's the problem with mini bursts. If you're not using them perfectly and you're not timing them properly, they can actually end up delaying your next burst, and that is something you absolutely do not want. As good as mini bursts are, they are nowhere near as good as your main burst in most cases. So if you're playing a class that has a mini burst, and a particularly good one, like a good example is Buccaneers, you should definitely get used to watching your cooldown timers and using them appropriately and not interfering with your main burst. Once again, main burst in almost every case is going to take priority, especially if you're in a party. So if this is something that you're going to struggle with personally by keeping track of 2 different sets of cooldowns essentially, just don't bother with it and worry about your main burst. That being said, the only way to get better at it is to force yourself to do it, but there are going to be cases like Chaos Gloom, or well, just Gloom in general, where sometimes his tentacles, they make the timing of the fight a little bit weird and don't activate your mini burst if it's been off cooldown for 20 seconds. So there's a good chance that's going to interfere with your real burst the next time you get a chance to do it. Number 7. Speaking of Gloom, Gloom is the perfect boss to really emphasize my next point, which is preparing your burst before you actually need to be bursting. Certain bosses give you windows that are designed for you to DPS them easily. Some excellent examples of this are Gloom, where Gloom resists damage for most of the fight and has vulnerability phases. Chaos Guardian Angel Slime, or just Guardian Angel Slime in general, makes you do the Guardian Wave, and after a successful one, it takes bonus damage and stuns itself. And possibly the most crucial one is Hard Lucid Phase 3, where you have to do a certain amount of damage in a small window or you fail the fight completely. These are all perfect examples of moments where you should be preparing your burst before you're actually able to be doing damage. If you're sitting there popping like an 8 to 10 button long burst, you are wasting upwards of like 10 seconds or more just popping buffs where you could be dealing damage with your burst. In some fights like Gloom, where many people will often be pushing it right up to the timer in some of their first instances, this can be the difference between you failing or succeeding. Now, this is something that takes some practice, not only with the class you're playing, but also the boss that you're fighting. But it's definitely something also very important to learn. It's also a little bit more crucial in party-based play, where someone else is going to be popping a burst and you would like to sync up with them. Number 8. Auto Health Potion. While I do consider this to be a pretty much mandatory thing for bossing, it's not something that should be absolutely relied on. It does have some moments where it's not perfect. You see, the way that the Auto Potter works is that it requires an action to actually check for an update on your health and whether or not it should use a potion. In most cases, you're always going to be attacking and triggering updates, but there will be cases in some boss fights where you're actually just running and jumping around, and those do not count as viable actions for your Auto Potter to trigger a check. There are also hurricane-based classes where holding a button down previously does not constitute an actual action to check. You really just need to be aware that this is the case, because if you don't actually watch it and know to manual pot or just do some action to trigger it, there will be times where this does actually cause you to die. I've seen it happen many times to other people when I'm watching them do bosses, and they're just confused why they died when they knew their potion was off cooldown. Generally, this is the reason. And the fix is really simple. Just be aware of it and constantly be doing actions to trigger it, or just keep your health potions bound. Number 9. Proper boss order. This is something that mostly applies to boss mules and not really your main, but it can be on your main, depending. It doesn't really have anything to do with killing the bosses themselves, but more so just saving time in the long run, especially if you have a lot of boss mules. For example, if you have a Lomian boss mule, it is best to start with Damien or Lotus, pop all your cooldowns, burst them as you usually would, and then fill the time where your burst is on cooldown with bosses like Pink Bean, Cygnus, Zakum, the ones that honestly they're not even really worth spending cooldowns on. As for your main, just try to fit bosses into your buffs. Most of your important buffs are going to last about 30 minutes, and sometimes that can be enough to fit several bosses in, and when they're on cooldown, you can do some of the bosses that don't require them. Very basic stuff, but I really just needed something to round this out to an even 10 because it sounds better. Speaking of which, number 10. By far the most important tip on this list. Why did I save it to the end? That's because I made an entire video on it, and that is buffs. If you would like to learn about every single buff you can use while bossing in MapleStory, particularly on the reboot server, I would recommend you go over to that video and check them out. The short of it is there are a ton of buffs available to us, enough that we can get upwards of like 50% stronger than we naturally are. On top of that, you can even get a Wild Hunter or Bishop to give you even more buffs. The Bishop particularly can give you Door. You probably see people asking for this all the time in Smegas, bosses in your guild chat, your alliance chat, whatever. When they ask for a door, the bishop can give them the Heaven's Door effect, and that essentially gives them an extra life in a boss fight. And one life, that's really enough to make a difference sometimes. So with that, that is all I got, because everything else is either class specific, boss specific, or I just didn't think about it. Or perhaps like Heroes Will, it just deserves a video of its own, because that is really such an important skill that not a lot of people utilize well. Myself included. I'm definitely guilty of it. I forget to use that thing all the time. But with that, thank you to my members and patrons for supporting me as always. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.